Welcome. We're very pleased to have you. Very excited for all of you. If you can imagine the possibility of being able to experience and communicate with all dimensions, multi dimensions, Jurgen has done it, and he describes what it is that he's done and how he does it. So I'm really happy to see you here, Jurgen. And so I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Craig. Nice to be here. Nice to be here. What happens basically? I go into meditation, and that I've been doing that all my life, really. And you very often get to areas where you what's the word? Transcend your normal mindset, and you get into an area of knowing. Okay, so it's basically you get into an area where when you pose a question, you very often find an answer, or if you don't find an answer, it's not very far away. You know, this happened when I had my first experience back in 1970, which came spontaneous, where I had quite a powerful experience of oneness. I can only describe it. It's not something that I was actually aiming for. It came spontaneously. And from then on, that happened very early on, after about 3 years of meditation. And from then on, I had started having these out-of-body experiences. And the reason these happened was because I've broken through the mind narrative, you know, through everything that you thought you knew, everything that, you know, was taken for granted. And this suddenly started opening new frontiers for me, you know. Then the out-of-body experiences started to happen. But the other thing that happened at the time, when I had this profound experience of oneness, I then had a presence in my life, which I always refer to as my silent companion. And this presence was not like a person, although it felt very personable, but it was like a presence or a being state, you know. So what I would do from then on, everything was directed towards this sort of presence. I called it an aspect of awareness. Okay, it felt like a person, but it was always silent. When I directed questions to it, or I wanted to find out things, it would respond to me with silence. And this space of silence would inevitably lead me to some knowing, a knowing state, and some answers. So not literal answers, but something sort of an awareness of things, you know. This presence would go away the moment I misbehaved, let's say, you know, the moment I became too engrossed in my ego, in my self-importance, in all these things, it just sort of disappeared. So I had a continuous motivation to reconnect to this presence in my life. And that was something that was always there. And it was also, it materialized during some of my out-of-body experience in the form of a guide. Now the guide, or could I say maybe there were several guides, but one in particular I had, who introduced me via an intensive training program into higher states of consciousness. This guy I met for the first time in the form of an Indian kind of sage. You know, he sort of appeared out of nowhere. And I've documented in my book, Multidimensional Man. And then from then on, he would appear during my out-of-body states, and he would set me tasks. And he also would sort of, you know, send me up and poke fun of me, and, you know, lead me up the garden path, and did all sorts of funny things with me. But after a while, he started communicating with me in in symbols. He would sort of flash an image to me, and I started getting more and more into the area of consciousness, which is expressed through symbols, sounds, and things like that. And then I started to get to know this kind of mental level much more, until one day I was guided through the different levels of consciousness, again into this very, very high strata, where I repeated on the inner level what I had first experienced spontaneously at the beginning of the 70s, you know. So these were two very significant events, all of which led to a deepening of my awareness. And then, of course, I started having a family, and my attention was diverted more towards a career, a house, and things like that. But I always meditated. I was always aware of my silent companion, if you like. But other things took priority, but they were still part and parcel of my learning program, you know, I went through. And then in 2013, I was thinking of writing another book after I'd written Multidimensional Man, because things had happened. So I went on a silent retreat in a mountain cabin in Scotland in order to write this book. And just before I went off on my journey, I told a friend of mine, and she said, well, you shouldn't really go on a retreat with an intention, you know, forget about it, you know. And I thought she had a really good point. So I decided I would just meditate and not do anything else, and focus my awareness on awareness. So I was armed with a diary, and I also wanted to write everything down I experienced, you know. So I took my camera with me. I went out after the meditation into this beautiful landscape. And so day after day, I got deeper and deeper into this state of solitary experience. And then towards the end, I had a really significant experience, which was the third time in my life I had this profound experience. And I knew then I could not go back for anything I had experienced before. It was almost as if an umbilical cord had been cut, you know, and I was no longer able to connect to my history, to my Jurgen Ziewe self, you know. And that was the big break. Then 2 years later, I then wrote Vistas of Infinity. And and since then, things just sort of developed from there, really. It's what I would say in spirituality, there is no end point. There's only a series of beginnings. You know, there is no goal you reach. There's no point ever where you say, okay, I'm now there, I'm here. You know, that doesn't work like that. So every morning I wake up is a beginning, the first day of an infinite future, so to speak. So that's basically, in very long words, what I like to say, perhaps.
Thank you, Jurgen. That's wonderful. Now, were you surprised about the success of Multidimensional Man?
Came about totally by accident, you know, because my daughter found my diaries, and she said, "What's this?" I have to say, I never spoke about my inner experiences to anybody. You know, the family I mentioned it to, but if I mentioned it to friends, they would just say, "Oh, there's Jürgen. He's got funny dreams." You know, that was it. So I knew I couldn't talk to anybody. Nobody in my area was sort of open to this sort of thing. Then one day, my eldest daughter found my diaries, a stack of diaries. She started looking through it, and she said, "What's all this about?" And that, I said, "Well, these are my out-of-body experience I recorded, you know." And she said, "Can I read them?" I said, "Yeah, sure." And then she started reading them, and she said, "Dad, I can't read your handwriting. Can you type it out for me?" You know. So then I took an interest again in my diaries, and I started reading them. And I suddenly, as I was reading it, I thought, "Oh, wow, there's a thread that runs through it, through the whole history, you know." And I could see there was a connection. So I got interested in typing it all out. And the other thing was, of course, by typing it, I had this, it became very close again, very near. And also, after I typed it all out, I thought printing it out on A4 sheets doesn't make any sense. So I heard about an online publisher called Lulu. So they would actually print it out in book form. And because I'm an illustrator and have done loads and loads of book covers, especially for sort of a new age publisher, I decided to make my own book cover. And then I sent it off. A few days later, I got it back. And then my daughter said, "Dad, you've got to edit it. That is terrible, you know." So I said, "Oh, well, why don't you give it to your husband?" He was had a degree in English and literature, and I gave him some money and he can edit it. So he came back, and then I printed out again. And then what happened was, when it came to me, when I got the proof, I ticked the box sell on Amazon, because I ticked a lot of boxes. And I didn't really take a closer look. But then suddenly I found I had a review on Amazon. And that was when I became aware the book was actually published. and, and, and everything went from there, from then on, you know. Then I had other people read it, and I received an invitation. I became very good friends with a person who invited me to give a talk on his out-of-body workshop. And so it gradually developed from there, you know.
What is different between what you discovered and the traditional experience of the Summerland?
The only other person I knew who had similar experience was Carlos Castaneda and Robert Monroe. And I read a few other books about that. But with regard to the reality levels I visited, I only found books done by automatic writers and channelers. And the first book, which came very close to my experiences, was Life in the World Unseen. And of course, that I was curious about it, but this, at the same time, there was a lot of literature which categorically stated what the afterlife is and what it isn't. And that confused me no end, because it didn't tie in with my experience. One of the things that was said was there is no night, there is no day, there's always the same light all the time, there's always the same temperature and things like that. That was in total contradiction to my own experience. So at first I thought, oh, maybe I'm wrong, you know. But then I began to trust my own experiences. I started interviewing people I met there, you know, and got first-hand information from people who actually lived there. And also I made tests, I tested it. I found out that consciousness is related to the external experience we have, you know. So I intensified my experiences, and also I extended them. You know, there's normally most out-of-body experiences last a short time. People will tell you that it usually doesn't last longer than a few minutes. It's similar to near-death experiences. But because of my intensive meditation, I was able to anchor my awareness in the environment until my mind became crystal clear, and then I could extend me being there. The other byproduct was I felt very much at home. It was like my home territory, and I quickly realized that is actually where we come from. That is our home turf, um, so I noticed when I started having extended out-of-body experiences, it was almost more difficult to get back to the body than it was staying there. Whereas normally, under normal circumstances, there's a strong pull from the body, to go back. But once you have overstepped this sort of threshold, it is quite easy to spend longer time in this kind of state. So I spent the next sort of 30 years really researching, interviewing people. And the other thing I developed, I have to tell you, I'm not a clairvoyant. I don't have any of these abilities, And if I do have them, which I sometimes do, they come very spontaneous, but I never really follow it up with anything. But when you're out of body, you have your senses are incredibly enhanced. And what you do when you interview people, not only do you sort of have mental contact with them, but you actually have the experiences they have. So you get a whole chunk of information in one go. So if somebody says, "Oh, I used to be a lorry driver," you're actually sitting in the cabin next to him and driving along, in his lorry. It's a very vivid, close experience when you're on the astral level. The information is much more easily accessible then, because you don't have the filter of the body. You can actually access the information much more lucidly, much more vividly. And on top of that, of course, it's a first-hand experience. You don't rely on other people to tell you information unless you, of course, ask them. So, so then I had plenty of time to test things out, to work out how people how people go about, how their mind affects their experiences, And gradually I came to realize the idea of night and day and cold and hot and warm, they're all states of consciousness. They're not external reality as such. So I found, for example, that people who were on a very negative state of consciousness, they were in continuous darkness or in a twilight, so they had they lived in an environment which wasn't very pleasant, not very bright. Whereas people who were on a more positive level, they lived in beautiful surrounding, beautiful, and I think that's where the word summerland comes from, a summery, beautiful atmosphere, a beautiful environment. And then I realized, okay, that's what these people have written about, they were in a different state of consciousness. And as I found out, there are millions of states of consciousness, and we create the environment we live in when we die simply by our attitude, our state of consciousness. So I remember one of the questions you asked was, how, I can't remember, was it about how, maybe you remembered, one of the questions had to do with, where we go, or how it differs, from this world. And the main thing I would say, or how to prepare yourself, how do you prepare yourself to make sure you have got a really nice time when we die, And I would say, be as positive as you can, focus on the love aspect, on the positive aspect, on the appreciation of life, and give yourself space to enjoy life, and all these things. That will almost guarantee that you have a nice sort of future ahead of you.
We were always led to believe that once people who suffered mental illness crossed over, they would receive treatment and everything would be fine. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yes, I mean, I had I worked with mentally ill people when I was a student back in the 70s, and I came to England, so I've got quite a good inside knowledge into mental illness. But there are so many variants of mental illness, of depression. Some of them are purely organic, and they are just like any other illness. Which when we sort of shed our body, the chemistry is simply no longer there to make us suffer in this way. The same with schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is usually a breakdown of the brain chemistry, and so when this happens, or Alzheimer's disease, when these things sort of come to an end, then there's no trace of these conditions anymore. But there are other conditions where people have pathological illnesses which were brought about by trauma, by fears, by all kinds of things which happen in life, and and they don't just simply disappear. In one way or another, you have to still work with these things, when you die, because it's only the body that dies. A lot of the mental energy is sort of still there in some form or another. I hate to say that, but it's not a given that if you have a problem, a mental problem, let's say you have a problem of extreme jealousy, which creates a sort of pathological personality disorder. If you suffer from this kind of illness, then you will still have to deal with it. You're still confronted with it. Like a lot of personality disorders, which are not organic, which may be not really your fault that you experience them, but the possibilities of getting help and assistance when you cross over are much, much greater, because there are a lot of people who feel very motivated to serve. Because one of the most powerful thing in life is what people realize, that the only thing that makes any real sense, gives you any real satisfaction, are the emotions of love, of compassion, and of service. And people very quickly catch on to this principle, because they know when these sort of emotions kick in, their experience become of a much higher quality. Their well-being increases, exponentially. And so it's a self-perpetuating aspect that goes on. And so these people want to go out and help other people. So there are always plenty of helpers. And there are also plenty of institutions where people are taken to receive help. There's no national health budget, where there's a shortage of resources, like in the UK, where the NHS is underfunded and people can't get help, or in America where you have to pay for your treatments. This is not there, because the scope is much, much greater. So people who have severe problems stand a much better chance to.
Can you tell us a little bit about the number of people that you've met on the other side that you knew in life?
So the first thing you have to be clear about, the next state is just as real, feels just as real, just as solid, just as physical as this state. And very often people who die, if they have never heard about it or read about it, they have no idea that they have died. And also the other thing is, which I noticed, the state of consciousness changes very subtly. For example, the best way to explain it is to imagine you having a dream. Okay, when you have a dream, weird things can happen, and not for a moment will you question there's anything extraordinary taking place. And if you were lucid in the dream, you would suddenly wake up and think, hang on a minute, that's ludicrous, that can't happen, I must be dreaming. And that is what people very often who are borderline lucid dreamers that catapults them into a wakeful state of consciousness. And again, there are so many different states between lucid dream and astral full conscious awareness, so there's a whole spectrum of a kind of awareness. But the thing that is most apparent is the physicality of the environment, so that people don't really give it much thought. And also the other thing is the critical faculties which we have developed in our waking life, they sort of become somewhat eroded. For example, we get used to this state quite naturally and quite quickly. So for example, if people want a cup of tea and they suddenly find themselves having a cup of tea, they don't very often question, how did I get the cup of tea? It just seems to happen more naturally. And we are very quick in sort of adapting to this new set of circumstances.
Just on that point, we often read in spiritualist literature that we have no need to eat or drink in the afterlife.
Well, there's another aspect attached to food and drink, and that's a social aspect, and we take this across when we go over to the next level. A lot of people still enjoy the social aspect of food. And the interesting thing is the food which is available to us is of an exceptional quality. It's beautiful, it tastes good. It has got extra sort of aspects of enjoyment to it, which we simply cannot have on this planet. It's almost as if our senses have opened up, and that always sort of fascinated me, that there is. I went to plenty of places where I tasted food, and even with my mother, she asked me to meet her friends. And these were people I met when I was a child, okay? And there was still this sort of feeling of recognition there, they had long died. And we had this kind of party atmosphere where we were eating and drinking and enjoying the food. And so I would say none of these enjoyments which we got accustomed to here have been taken away from us. If anything, they're much enhanced. There are so many things. It's not just that we are less in a hurry. We actually more given to the enjoyment, the pleasure aspect of life. This is compared to that. This physical life is such a downer in a way. It's so limited in our sensual awareness, when we compare it to what we can experience. Now, of course, that's not a universal aspect of it, because people who are dominated by very negative feelings, they don't have access to these extraordinary sensual awareness. For example, in my book, Visits of Infinity, I described what happens to some of these people, where they live and how poor they are and how poor they look, because they seem to be divorced from the creative spiritual aspect which makes life happen. And so they're focused on negativity and they attract negative things. And the food smells bad, if there even is any food. The vegetation is usually very drab, or the trees have no leaves. It is literally cold, and dark and things like that. There are these things. And if people don't find a way out of it, that becomes their reality then, habits. People who have been addicted to habits, there's no incentive or there's no reason why these habits would change. If they have been going to the pub every day, they will continue going to the pub.
So is there still addiction? Like, do people take drugs on the other side? I mean, are there treatment facilities for addiction?
Well, addictions are mental aspect. They usually, there are plenty of helpers who will actually help you with your addiction if you want to seek help with it, you know. But some people don't want any help, and they're so tied to their addiction until there comes a point of where it's just simply not giving them any benefit anymore, you know. Then they may break out of the cycle. And it's like that with all experience, you know. We go through cycles of experience until there comes a point where we derive a benefit from the experience and say, okay, no more, that's it, you know, I want to move on from now on. And I had this with people who were wandering around the lower dimensional levels, which I call the very near Earth levels, but even slightly sort of darker than the Earth's life, you know. And they're simply bored out of their minds. There's nothing to do, you know. And they ask you, how do I get out of here? You know, how? And so they gradually have to either wear themselves down, or they have to find an initiative, or they have to be inspired by other people to leave the drabness of the environment and move on. This can take a long time. That's why it's so important that we keep alive, you know, and keep enjoying life, you know. So it's an incredible wide spectrum of experiences we can gain there.
Well, I think at that point we'll open it up to questions.
Hi, Jurgen.
Hi, Greg.
This is such a wonderful phenomenon, and is it possible to teach, even at a minor level, even at a 5 or 10% level, teach people how to have something in which they can participate in this kind of activity so that they can see the other dimensions? And then secondarily, is it possible to then teach people to go to that better level, to the level that you're at, in being able to have those out-of-body experiences?
Yes, there are quite a number of teachers now, and books being written. A friend of mine, he's a psychologist, Robert Wagner, he has written a book, Lucid Dreaming, Gateway to the Inner Self. Now, as a psychologist, he was not allowed, he told me, to really go into the area of out-of-body experience, because at that time the book came out, that was not an acceptable scientific sort of phenomena. That was more regarded as a hallucination at that time his book came out. But they did accept the phenomena of lucid dreaming. And lucid dreaming can be learned, can be practiced. And what I discovered, because a lot of my out-of-body experiences were triggered by a lucid dream, that actually that is the most natural process of accessing our alternative realities, you know. And if you look at authors of lucid dreaming, you will always find a technique which gives you the first step, which is lucid dreaming, and the next step. And I've refined that, because lucid dreaming and out-of-body experiences are different. In lucid dreaming, you are dreaming, but you are aware that you're dreaming. In an out-of-body experience, you are not dreaming, you are actually aware like you would be in this physical life, but on another reality level. So what I did, the moment I had a lucid dream, and lucid dreams are characterized as usually some sort of narrative going on, like in a dream. Something is happening, some story is unfolding, you know, there are people doing things and you're watching stuff and people interacting with you. And then when you become lucid, you suddenly have control over your dream. You can then take a part in the dream, you can interact with the people, but you can also then use a trigger and catapult yourself into a state of wakefulness. At that point, for example, what I normally do when I become lucid in my dream, I focus my attention either on my hands or on the ground until I can see everything very clear. And at that point, the dream narrative collapses. the dream disappears. The people vanish from your side, the people you have interacted with, and suddenly you find yourself in a here and now reality where nothing happens, you know, and then you know you are in another alternative reality, and then you take it from there. So this discrimination between lucid dream and out-of-body experience becomes clear when you focus your awareness on the now, on the here and now, via focusing, you know, on the environment.
So we could teach people how to do this on a Zoom meeting?
Yeah, I mean, I never saw myself as a teacher. I'm more like a reporter. I never sort of taken an interest in actually teaching, but there are quite a few people which you maybe want to invite. You know, one of the people I can really recommend is Robert Wagner. The other person who is very good at it is William Buhlman, who I met in 2013, and we had a long chat about it. He also teaches it. In America, there's a Monroe Institute. There are various, institutes, and there are various people I know of who actually teach the technique, and that usually starts by becoming aware of your dream life, you know. So the first thing I would recommend is to take a greater active interest in your dream. And the way to do that is to have a diary next to your bed. And the moment you have a dream and you wake up, not to move, not to do anything, not to open your eyes, but simply sort of recall your dream before you even open your eyes. And then once you opened your eyes, you write down the dream in your diary, and then go through the whole process again, and then go back to sleep. Then when you have another dream, you do the same process. And that shifts your awareness onto your dream reality, you know. And I would say dreaming is actually nature's way of allowing us into the higher dimensional levels, but we sort of so externalized, we totally lost our ability to dream, you know, or to connect to this world. But nature has provided this very natural gateway for us, you know, to open and walk through it. So once we've done this for, let's say, a few weeks, our dream recall becomes much better. And then we also become aware of certain repeats in our dream, you know. Suddenly we realize, oh, I've been there before, you know. My typical dream is, which always signals that I'm having a dream, is when I lose my car, or my car is stolen, you know, which tells me I'm on the astral level, because my car has never been stolen. I never lost my car, you know. So I think, oh, hang on, it's this car again. Where is it? And then, oh, I'm dreaming, you know. So I use it as a clue to become aware. I then look on my hands, and lo and behold, I'm now in the astral level, you know. So there's a bit of practice. When we practice dreaming, these things play a much greater role in our lives. And the first thing is the aspect of becoming lucid in our dream. Now, lucidity in our dream is a completely fantastic and beautiful state of consciousness. Some lucid dreamers say, forget about astral travel. You know, lucid dream is a bee's knees, because then you can fulfill all your wildest imagination, all your wishes, you know. You can even enter into your higher self, you know. You have got much more at your disposal, because when you have an out-of-body experience, basically you cut this possibility off. You simply enter into another dimension, you know, and then life continues just as it did here. So you have to make plans, you have to decide what to do, where to go, you know, and things like that. Whereas a lucid dream, the world is your oyster, you know. You're still fully aware, but everything is happening in the fantasy world of your subconscious, you know, and you have control over it. And I know a friend of mine, she's a psychologist, she uses lucid dreaming to teach kids lucid dreaming so they can deal with traumas, you know. So she teaches them, if they have anxieties and traumas, to become lucid, and then they can confront their anxiety and control it.
I lucid dream quite a bit. I think once I got maybe for a second into an out-of-body state, but the problem for me is that I usually, I believe, just get frightened. But before I know it, I'm awake in my room going, why did you wake yourself up? Sometimes I'll say, oh, I'm weightless. I can fly, and I'll think up and I'll go right up through, you know, through the roof, and I'll start going, and then it's almost like, oh my God, will I get back? Some fear, almost, it seems that it's fear that just kind of overtakes me, and I wake up in my room frustrated. So do you have any suggestions on what I might say to myself in that situation?
Yeah, the first thing I would say to myself is nothing can happen to you. Nothing. You can't die. You can control, because you're already dead in a way, you know.
Yes, I understand.
So nothing really can happen to you. Fear is the biggest stumbling block for lots of people, you know, but with a bit of practice you overcome it. The first thing is, when you become lucid in your dream, is to embrace it and sort of reinforce a positive aspect and feel, oh great, I can do anything I like now, you know. I can go
Right.
any way I want to, you know. So that's the first thing I would do, and I would practice it before you go to sleep by nurturing these positive feelings, you know, this positive appreciation and imagine beautiful things, you know. So you get to bed into a
Right. Raise my
state of mind.
consciousness. Yeah.
Yeah.
Try to
yeah.
raise my consciousness a little
Yes,
bit before entering in. And also, I guess, the concept of telling myself I'm safe is kind of what you're saying, that I am safe, that I will be safe.
Yeah.
I can explore.
Yeah, you will be totally safe. You know, there's nothing really that can happen to you. And that's a beautiful thing. You know, once you trust it, just the aspect of trust itself, the feeling of trust is enough to get you into a totally safe zone.
I have two questions now
Thank
for
you.
The first one is to any children that could shed a light on why they've left the Earth earlier than anticipated. Have you spoken with them? And can you tell us what they've told you?
Well, I haven't had a lot of experience directly with children. I met children, you know, regularly. In one instance, I was in a play school, you know, where there was a whole group of children enjoying themselves, playing and things like that. I always had a very positive feeling, you know, radiating from these children when I had them. And then, of course, I met children who were dreaming, you know, and they were actually on the astral plane, and they were sort of hanging out there and carrying on with their games and everything. But I only really record my actual experience. I never really investigated the phenomena of why children die young and come over there. But the one thing I would say is there's continuity in their development, you know, and there's really nothing really bad happens when a child dies. From a child's point of view, nothing really bad happens. It's only for the parents, you know. But for the children, it's just a continuation of development, you know, of their progress. So they would never see anything bad happen to them. It's all a big game. From a kid's point of view, it it's not a negative, not necessarily a negative experience.
No,
That they
no.
don't live out a normal life. It may just be that there was no need to carry on anymore.
Hi, Jurgen. I'm
Oh,
on
hi,
the south. I'm on the south coast of England too, not
Oh,
far
are
from
you?
you.
Okay.
I got two questions related to some interviews they're related, I think. Otherwise, I wouldn't hold the time that I've seen you do recently. And thank you for your work, because I think it's very significant. You talked about dropping acid when you're at art school, and we're of the same generation, so I have my own personal experiences of that. But when I was looking at, I can't remember the name, Karen, somebody you were having a Skype call with or something. It's on YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
And you talked about the stuff that really, I came to the conclusion, this is philosophical really,
Mm-hmm.
that actually nothing exists by what you're saying, because there's no definition of what existence is.
Mm-hmm.
And related to that was, you also talked about meeting a chap who was dead when you went on one of your out-of-body experiences. Was a chap named Brian who died of cancer, yes. and
Yeah.
You talked about cars and
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
And it's a related question, but it's a bit more concrete, is how did he explain, if he didn't know he was dead, that his wife wouldn't talk to him?
Well, I didn't get that far, but the thing is, when I met Brian, he didn't really have much in common with his wife. You know, there was a sort of they didn't really have a relationship as such. So it was quite natural for him not to miss her or not to have a connection with him. The thing is, the one thing that becomes very prominent, people are quickly enter their own little world. You know, before he may have locked himself in his office and do all sorts of things and never given his wife a second thought, you know. So that kind of habit may have sort of carried on, not even missing his wife, because it's all in the mind, more or less, you know. What was interesting is because he had cancer and he was very, very sick, and then he died, you know. And so I said to him, "Oh, hi, Brian. You know, how are you?" He said, "Oh, I'm a lot better. You know, now I'm still getting over it, but I'm a lot better." And he had no concept of that he was dead. He was just thinking he was gradually getting better, you know. And then we talked. The only thing we had in common, because his wife and my wife were friends, and so I visited them. The only thing we ever had in common was to talk about cars, because he was into cars, you know. So then when I met him out of body, he changed the subject back to cars, because that's how we sort of normally communicated on that level, you know.
Reincarnation, Jurgen. I remember in one of your talks or writings, you talked about having, in a higher state, having access to a lot of your past lives. Can you like to speak to that?
Yes, that was, I had in my first book, I documented a lot of past life experiences. And the reason I had these experiences because they related to my present life in some way or another. And without going into too much detail, in my book, Multidimensional Man, I go into more detail of how it related, you know. But then later I found out, once you get into a higher state of consciousness, it's almost like being on a platform where you can see the totality of yourself, which is everything you have experienced, everything, all the potentiality. And the way I could sort of picture it, or the metaphor I could find, was there are lots of little, it's like a tapestry, lots of little images. And each image you can zoom into, and then you find access to a past experience. That can be in this life, but that can also be in any other life. and I suddenly saw there was this whole totality of myself which made up my identity, and I could zoom into any part of it. One was even where I lived a life on a completely different planet, you know, and where things were remarkably different to the life I was living here. And then also past experiences where I was a soldier, you know, or in one experience I was a mean sort of spirited rich guy, you know, and all these things come together. And what happens was you create a picture, and you become very aware of. You become aware of a greater understanding of who and what you are. Suddenly, the things which you were, you know, concerned about, or you were in doubt about, you suddenly think, oh, that's why I have this feeling. This is where it comes from, you know. So you can have, at some stage, you can have a very good overview of who you are and what you are, because you're connected to every aspect of yourself, you know. And it's a fascinating experience. But this can really only happen when you lose your identification in a way. If you stop being identified with a personal self, you know, or your normal everyday self, when you break this barrier, you can then have a much better overview of your reality.
Jurgen, many of us are dealing with parents who have lost children, and when they hear about reincarnation, they are very concerned that when they cross over, they won't be reunited with that child, that child will have gone on to reincarnate somewhere else.
The first practical experience I had was when I met my father. I lost my father when I was 9 years old, okay? And during all my out-of-body experiences, he was the one person who was always absent, you know. So for a number of times later, I talked to my mother about it, who had died, and I asked about my father, and she was a bit evasive, you know, almost as if they had sort of lost contact with each other. Then one day I made a distinct effort to find my father, and I was taken to a farmyard in which I identified to be Russia, and I saw two boys. One was about 9 and the other one was about sort of 11 years old. and one of the boys I immediately recognized as my father. He was riding a bicycle and he stopped, and as I was sort of confronting him in my out-of-body state, he stopped and he said, "Jurgen," you know, and he recognized me. And that was really significant to me, because from then on, I knew that the person we deem to have lost is never lost, because they always have an astral body, whether they're incarnated or not, which has a much greater access to the memory, you know. So if you are, let's say, in your dream, you will actually meet the person. It doesn't matter what level they are on, whether they're incarnated or not. On the astral level, they will still recognize you, you know, because they've got the whole totality of their memory still in place. It can even go to a point that they revert back to the person you have known, you know, because the astral state is such a fluid, dynamic state, you know, that you wouldn't even become aware that they have another body on another level, you know.
Thank you. Thank you.
Jurgen, in your Vistas of Infinity, you do talk about finding paintings that you had done, that you must have done, that you were not aware of. And this raises the question, do we have an alternate self which stays on the astral level doing things that our physical self is not aware of?
Yes, absolutely, yes. And I think I had this confirmed by other people, you know, had similar experiences. We really lead a double life, we are not even aware of. And the most significant thing I find is that I return over and over again to the same house, which I recognize as my house, and I see it sort of progressing and taking shape, and I'm confronted with activities. I do a whole range of paintings, because at the moment I don't do a lot of painting anymore, but when I went to Hamburg, I was an abstract painter. And when I go back into my out-of-body state, I suddenly get confronted with an exhibition I've had done, and paintings, really big, massive paintings, and I recognize each painting. I recognize each brushstroke and the feeling that went into it. And I said, oh my God, how is that possible? How can I actually have created all this work? And yet in my real life, I don't do any of this kind of style, but I clearly recognize it as my work, So that has happened lots of times. So we are not one-dimensional entities, we are multidimensional entities, and that becomes clear when we become astrally aware, and we suddenly find we also have a different social life. We meet with people and communicate with people who are really dear friends. And when we get back to the physical body, we think, oh, who was that? Who was that person? And we have no recollection of that person from the physical life. And yet we are so connected with that person that we wonder, how can it even be possible that there's no trace of this person here? So we do lead double or triple lives, on different levels. We are such incredibly complex and multidimensional entities. It's staggering, we have such a closed down awareness down here, which is completely focused on our physical reality, and there's very little room to break out of it, because everything is processed through our senses. It's only when we go into meditation, we shut the world out, that we gradually sort of become more aware of our higher senses, and that's where things start happening.
In the last 10 years, or since Multidimensional Man came out, do you think there's been a change in awareness of out-of-body experiences? You mentioned earlier that your friend, who was a psychologist, that 10 years ago, he couldn't talk about out-of-body experiences. My perception is that it's just exploded, that the knowledge has exploded. I'm just interested in your perspective.
Yes, I think that's actually what's taking place. I think we are very quickly reaching a tipping point. It's like people often use the example of the 100th monkey syndrome, or when, for example, a rat is taught certain tricks in one town, and other rats pick up the trick much easier when they are sort of confronted. It's this sort of thing. There's a unity consciousness behind everything, okay? And what we do individually has an effect on the non-physical level in terms of the energy which we bring out and awareness. We are broadcasters. Every one of us is a broadcaster, and especially if we have developing a higher awareness or more positive awareness, the broadcasting is more powerful. It's more powerful than negative awareness, because the frequency is much higher. So when this is reinforced, it inspires other people, and it triggers a similar sort of synchronicity in the people. So it's almost like if you strike a note in a room on a glass, and then suddenly other glasses vibrate to the same tune, or if you have an instrument and you strike a certain note and there are other instruments in the room, they will pick up the frequency and they vibrate, there's a physical fact. So what we're doing is, when we are on a point of awareness, we actually enhancing the general wavelengths so more people find easy access. And I don't know whether you've heard about this guy, Rick Archer, Buddha at the Gas Pump. He always invites people, awakening people. And there are more and more people. And when you listen to them, they all report the same thing, more or less, in their own unique, different ways. And it's quite incredible how much coherence is, you know, continuity between different people coming from totally different backgrounds, you know, and that's really a powerful thing that's taking place. And that's why I'm not feeling negative at all about our future, because people think, okay, the world is going towards self-destruction. We need to do something now. And the only way that will happen is that we all suddenly become aware, and there's a place of urgency taking place, and sooner or later nobody will be able to resist it. And then it's the same thing what will happen before we discovered that the Earth rotated around the sun. You know, suddenly this mindset will shift, and people will accept it. And now we already have in physics the realization that people can no longer deal with the materialistic understanding of physics. They just reach a dead end. Now, new physics are coming into the scene. They talk about energies or electricity or fields and things like that. So they're very quickly approaching what we have been talking about for so many years. You know, soon there will be a convergence, and then people will realize the reality of what this reality actually is made of. And that is a very significant time we live in.
And Jurgen, I think on that note, that I'd like to just thank you for your work, because I think you have pushed the field so much further forward, particularly in our area of afterlife studies. I think when you started, people who were looking at the afterlife were more restricted to mediumship and channeling. And I think the whole out-of-body field and what out-of-body explorers have to contribute has just been a massive, massive increase. And what I love about your work is that it does integrate so much: the spirituality, the understanding of past lives, life planning, and it's all there in your books and your experiences.
I would say one more thing is, perhaps I find it is harder to be a medium than to be an out-of-body experiencer, because we already are out-of-body experiencers. You know, when we go to sleep at night, you know, it's basically our natural gateway. Whereas I really admire mediums, because they've got this openness, this connection, you know, to the self while they're in their body, you know. But I would find, if people were to find out information, they should pay more attention to their dreams, and then they find a very natural entry point to nature, via nature, you know, through their dream. And that's what I would like to see, that people pay more attention to their dreams.
Jurgen, it was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Want to talk with you more about the possibility of how we can help people to have these experiences, because our goal is to have the whole world have experiences like this, so humankind changes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.